I tell people what they want to hear. So it's all a matter of conditioning. And when people can begin to condition themselves to understand greater truths, then maybe the people who stand before you on Sunday can begin to present those greater truths to you so that you can begin to control your life, your community, and your destiny instead of praying to others to do for you what you've always had the capacity to do. This is the challenge that we're faced with. What's important is that for the last 1,600 years, a world has been shaped. Our perception of the world, our perception of reality, has been shaped by European explorers, colonizers, and enslavers. And they have historically used the Bible and the sword to conquer indigenous people all over this earth and to teach them to worship a God who looked like their conquerors. This action was initiated by Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, who wasn't even a Christian. If you read the stories about Constantine, he was a Christian emperor, but he was not a Christian himself, who in 312 ACE, on the eve of a major battle, had a vision. And in this vision, God came to him and said that he would grant Constantine victory if he fought under the sign of the cross. And so Constantine had all of his soldiers paint on their shields the Greek letters chi and rho. The Greek letters chi and rho are the first two letters in the word Christ. And they fought under the banner of Christ, and they were victorious. Now, they used the letters chi and rho because the letter J had not been invented at that point in time. All right, let's put all of the dots together so that when we connect them, we understand what we see. Constantine was victorious in his battle, and he discovered a weapon that was more powerful than any nuclear weapon. Constantine discovered the power of theological warfare, and he conquered people in the name of God. And he imposed upon those that he conquered who had different beliefs this idea that if you didn't worship my God, then I was justified to do whatever I want to you. If you were a pagan, if you were an infidel, I could kill you, I could rape you, I could rob from you, I could do whatever I wanted to do because you were not a believer in my God. Now, it's important to realize and understand some of these definitions. Pagan is not necessarily a negative thing. The word pagan simply means somebody who worships a God different from yours. That's all pagan means. So to a Jew, a Christian is a pagan. To a Muslim, Jews and Christians are pagan. They simply worship a God different than their own. There's nothing bad or derogatory or evil about that word if you understand it in its correct context. Every European conqueror, from Columbus to Cortez to Washington, engaged in theological warfare. And each of these men violated the very commandments that they taught their slaves to adhere to. America is a Christian nation because America was founded by Christians who stole the land from the indigenous people, who murdered and who enslaved others, and taught those that they conquered, those that they enslaved, to believe in a doctrine that they did not adhere to themselves. And of course, these issues are never brought up in school. They're seldom brought up or discussed in church. It's something that we're just supposed to look the other way when it comes to. Act as if it didn't exist. And so it's important for us to begin to cultivate a different relationship with Spirit, a different relationship with the Creator, if we are to change the quality of our lives here in this country or anywhere else on earth. The study of history reveals that European world dominance is on the decline. Europeans are losing their control as people of color begin to assert themselves globally. And for the first time in history, for the first time in the last 2,000 years, the majority of Christians are non-European. That's one of the reasons why Pope John Paul II has traveled more to Africa than all of the popes combined. He's traveled more to South America than all of the popes combined because he knows that the future of Catholicism is in people of color. So they are proselytizing and working overtime to see to it that they will have new members to keep them in power. In light of the imminent shift to world power and consciousness, European theologians and scholars have been devising new ways to consolidate their power. And for decades, they have been meeting behind closed doors. I remember at least 15 years ago, hearing Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark in a conversation talk about a meeting, a conference that was held by Jewish theologians here in New York, where they talked about the origins of the Torah. And they talked about all the myths and the symbolism that was in this text and how it was not a text to be taken literally. And that for some reason or another, there was never any documentation about this conference that was released. But if you read the popular literature, many of the major national magazines, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, if you notice over the last 5 years, you've been seeing a plethora of cover stories that are reevaluating religion, reevaluating Jesus the Christ, reevaluating Moses, reevaluating the concept of heaven and hell. There's this conversation that is going on behind closed doors that is now slowly being introduced to the general public. Why? What does that mean? It means that you are slowly being prepared for a bombshell that is going to be dropped in the very near future. And people are positioning themselves so that once this new information comes out, you can continue to look to them for continued leadership. I reference specifically an article that was published just this year, March of this year in Harper's Magazine. The article was entitled, "False Testament, How Archaeology Refutes the Bible's Claim to History." And it's written by Daniel Lazari, a Jewish writer, who cited the latest biblical archaeological research that refutes the Old Testament. And let me just share with you some of the highlights that were in this article, because it's so profoundly significant. It's significant because of the fact that it hasn't been talked about in the general community, but others are beginning to talk about it more openly. Some of the points that he raised in this article is that Israelites who are now thought to have been an indigenous culture that developed west of the Jordan River around 1200 BCE. And they did not originate in Mesopotamia as they claim. There is no archaeological evidence to support the fact that they immigrated to that area called Palestine from elsewhere. Another important point, and this one hits right at the heart of the matter, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and other tribal founders depicted in the book of Genesis, and this is his quote, a direct quote, were no more real than the gods of Greece or Norse mythology. That they were not real personalities. These are Jews telling their story to the world. They also said that Moses never existed. I want you to understand this. They are saying that Moses never existed and that the Israeli flight from Egypt never occurred. Understand what they're saying. So it's you can find it in Harper's Magazine, March 2000. Very interesting story. And this whole story was derived from a new Torah that was published in November of last year called the Et Hayim, or the Tree of Life. It was published by the United Synagogue of Conservative Jews. And in this Torah, they added in the commentary the latest archaeological research that refutes the Old Testament. Now, the interesting thing about biblical archaeology is that it's a science that's about 100 years old, and it was originally created in order to bolster the credibility of the Bible. But specifically within the last 25 years, the physical evidence has said that what existed in this book is not a fact, are now seen as, quote, an invention of Jerusalem-based priests in the 7th and 8th century BCE. Solomon and David were not the great kings that they were purported to have been in the Old Testament. They also said that the walls of Jericho, Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, well, they said that based on the archaeological evidence, the wall was only 2 feet high at the time that Joshua came there, and had been destroyed for at least 70 years prior to his conquest of that land. So the myths, the stories that we have been given are now have to be viewed through a different pair of eyes in light of the evidence that is now being allowed to circulate among the general public. And so the challenge for us is, how do you process that information? Do you categorically deny it and throw it away simply because it challenges everything that you've been taught? Or do you begin to read it and study it to understand the truth that may be in this information? It's important to understand it. Another profound statement in this new Torah was that Genesis, the book of Genesis, was, again, quoting from them, an artificial construct. It was a narrative framework created long after the facts in order to link together a series of unconnected folk tales like pearls on a string. In other words, they made it up. And so, understand the domino effect that we're dealing with. If Genesis was a fabrication, which they say it was, then it means that God didn't create the world in 7 days, or their God did not create the world in 7 days. It meant that their God did not create Adam and Eve, and they were never expelled from Eden, which means then that there was no original sin, and there was no reason for anybody to come back and die for sins that you never committed in the first place. As religion is being reevaluated, we're hearing more and more talk about spirituality. We're hearing more and more talk about different ways to know the Creator. So we're hearing more about indigenous people here in this land, indigenous people in Africa, indigenous people in the Pacific Islands, in South America, and how they relate to the Creator. And so it's important for us to take all of this information and look at it and evaluate it from an African-centered context. If we do that, then at least we'll be starting off on the right foot. Looking at this information from an African-centered context means that we have to first accept the fact that humanity began first in Africa. Matter of fact, there was an article published just this last Tuesday that stated that archaeologists have found what they believe to be the oldest human skull, 7 million years old, in Chad in Central Africa. So as they do more of the archaeological research, what they're beginning to realize is they don't know how long humans have been on this planet, but the greatest evidence for the existence of humanity can only be found in Africa. So Africa is the place where everything begins. So we have to begin to see Africa through different eyes. Since Africa was the birthplace of humanity, we also have to acknowledge the fact that Africa is the birthplace of civilization. Dr. Ben has devoted his life to teaching us about the Nile Valley origins of civilization. And it's in the Nile Valley where you can find the first organized first organized method of relating to a force more powerful than you, an unseen force. There were literally thousands of texts that were written by our ancestors thousands of years ago that talked about ways of cultivating a relationship with this force so that you could empower yourself, because they knew something that we've forgotten. You know, what's interesting, let me just share this with you. I've been traveling to Kemet for 22 years, and have probably been there maybe about 35, 36 times. You know, the first couple of times you go, you know, you you're very excited about being there, and you're tripping out on the fact that, oh, we were here, and we built this, and we did that. But after you get past all of that and realize that the Arabs control this land, and we ain't never getting it back. And we ain't never getting it back. All right? But there's a lot there that we can study, that we can examine. And once I began to accept that reality and began to take my time walking through the temples, looking at the columns, and imagining the architectural energy that went into creating it, the engineering skills that went into designing it, all the artists and craftspersons that were responsible for building these temples that have stood for thousands and thousands of years. And I began to see this place, or try to see this place, through the eyes of the people who created it when it was brand new. And doing that made me realize that we, so-called modern human beings, are literally functioning on a subhuman level. That the people who created this ancient culture and civilization knew how to manifest the aspects of God, the creator, whatever term you want to use. They knew how to manifest that knowledge within themselves so that they literally created heaven on earth. And when you walk through these temples and see the monuments, you will see the handiwork of people who knew how to manifest God within them, and they built for eternity. That's one of the reasons why Europeans over the last 3,000 years have been trying to claim Kemet for themselves. Because it is there where you can find the record of what men and women did when they were more closely connected to the creative force than we could ever imagine.